Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Day Chats. I am your host, Daisy Michelle. If this is your first time listening, welcome to the show. This whole podcast is about embracing our not so great moments, psychoanalyzing ourselves, and being honest with ourselves and the things that happen because realistically, people usually only talk about the good stuff. On this podcast, we like to be real and open about even the bad stuff that happens. So let's get right into the episode. Today's episode is about imposter syndrome and how to overcome it. So let's start by defining what imposter syndrome even is. Imposter syndrome is also known as imposter phenomenon or fraud symptom. It's a psychological pattern in which someone doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments and has this persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. It's the feeling that you somehow finessed your way into the system to get a job or take a seat that you're not actually qualified for, even though you may actually be very qualified. It's present most commonly in the workforce, but it can also be experienced in new settings, such as a classroom setting as well. I have definitely experienced imposter syndrome before. I would say I experienced it academically in high school when I first started taking an AP class. I felt that everyone around me was so much more smarter than I was and was more qualified to be in that classroom. I felt since all I had to do was check off a box that I wanted to be in the class, that it wasn't a real fair representation of my abilities and their abilities. I felt as if they had an upper hand leverage than I did, even though we were all in the same grade. Therefore, it was all of our first AP class taking it as a whole. So that was the first time I felt imposter syndrome academically. I really felt the need to constantly try to one up or prove myself to them, not in a bragging way, but just in a way where I felt that I fit in academically to their level of knowledge. Moving forward, I didn't experience imposter syndrome again, most notably until after I graduated college and I entered the workforce. It wasn't until I started working as an interpreter that I started to feel like I wasn't qualified for my job. I specifically remember feeling as if I had tricked the interviewers that I was somehow qualified to have this position. I felt like I wasn't qualified because I didn't have an interpreting certificate. I didn't go to school specifically to become an interpreter. Although I did have a minor in Spanish, I did take classes that would prepare me to be an interpreter and translator. I still somehow felt that not having that additional certification meant that I wasn't as qualified to do my job, given that my coworker who was hired alongside me did have her certification. So I already felt like I was at some kind of disadvantage on that sense. After some time, however, I started to feel more normal. I started to feel like I did belong there because I started to get the grasp of my job and I started to feel like all my studying had come to practice because I constantly felt like I needed to study. I constantly was preparing and trying to look up things and how to prepare for these meetings. I mainly deal with IEP meetings, so I was constantly trying to find any and all resources, both in English and Spanish, of IEP meetings, how to conduct them, how they typically go, reports. That way I could try to get my hands on everything so I could be prepared in a sense, so I wouldn't get caught off guard and I wouldn't get caught slipping, if you want to think about it that way. I wanted to know everything about it, so I was always so prepared. So after some time, I've been at my job now for over a year, and I feel very comfortable in my abilities to be an interpreter and translator. But that's not to say that the feeling of being an imposter went away all completely. Over the summer, I took over my coworker's position while she was on maternity leave. So I was my boss's secretary and assistant. And doing so meant that I was taking on new challenges, new responsibilities, and new duties that I had never been prepared for. And so I started to feel that feeling of imposter again. I was feeling it creep up on me, feeling like I wasn't qualified enough to be dealing with the matters that I was dealing with, that I had no idea what to do. it took a lot for me to start feeling like I was actually able to produce good content. And I think it was especially hard because this summer is when we were planning for online learning. I do work for a school district. So we were trying to figure out how to plan distance learning. And it was so crazy because everything was changing constantly. Everybody was on this new boat of not knowing what to expect or what to do. So it just felt like no matter how much I prepared for it, because everything kept changing almost quite literally every single day, I was never prepared enough. The feeling of being an imposter or a fraud was extremely prevalent this summer. Thankfully, I got to the point where I was able to manage my duties in the midst of everything that was going on, but it was still a really difficult time. And it just reminded me that no matter how hard I work and no matter how prepared I am, that feeling of being an imposter somehow just doesn't go away for me. So now I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the characteristics of imposter syndrome. Now, all of these characteristics are ones that I found on verywellmind.com, and I will link it below. I'm going to try to do show notes for each episode moving forward because I do like to do a little bit of research on the topics that I'm talking about. And I would love for you all to be able to have access to the resources that I'm using. That way, you can all continue looking and using that as a stepping stone so you can continue your knowledge on whatever topic it is that we're talking about. So, the characteristics of imposter syndrome are self doubt, over preparing to avoid being caught as a fraud, attributing your success to external factors such as luck, fear that you won't live up to your expectations, being an overachiever, sabotaging your success, and setting unrealistic and challenging goals for yourself, and then feeling overly disappointed when you fall short. So, where does this all stem from? A study conducted in 1978 by Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes from Georgia State University showed that in a room of 150 successful women, which keep in mind, all of which had high academic and professional achievements, all had rigorous courses of study completed, such as their PhDs, felt that they did not meet or feel the internal success that they had in actuality. Many of which felt that they somehow tricked everyone into believing that they were smart and knowledgeable in their chosen fields. They attribute their success to an external factor, such as a fluke in the system or getting admitted by accident, rather than acknowledging that they worked really hard to get the achievements and successes they've had. And while this study focuses on women specifically, since then, many studies have shown that men also face the struggles of imposter syndrome. So this is not only uniquely specific to women. Now, something that I also feel is very important to consider is your upbringing and your family dynamics. So, as a member of a minoritized community and a daughter of two blue collar working parents, I completely recognize that my upbringing had some kind of conflict and contribution to my experience with imposter syndrome now as an adult. Growing up, I didn't have someone that looked like me in positions of authority. I didn't have someone that I personally connected with or that I saw that was brown and Latina in a position of power or authority. So it was hard for me to be able to envision myself as a leader when there was no one there for me to follow. And I'm not talking about my parents because my parents always set a good example for me. But again, I'm thinking beyond the family dynamic now. I'm thinking in who I saw when I was growing up in social media, as I got older, and on television when I was younger. Oftentimes, I saw my community being the employees and not the employers. So, again, how could I envision myself being an employer or a leader when there was no one for me in my head to follow in their footsteps? So, now as an adult, I am somewhat creating a path for those behind me who want to be in those positions where either I am now or I will be in the future. When I think about being an attorney, it's hard for me to envision myself as one, not because I don't believe in myself, but because I feel like I'm stepping into unfound territory. And something that has helped with that is finding networks that do show people like myself in those positions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the episode. But when you feel you're creating a new path for those behind you to follow, it almost feels as if all eyes are on you. There's little room for error It almost feels like everything has to be done perfectly or to a T because you don't want people to look at you as a failure or that you don't know what you're doing. And again, it's just an endless cycle of feeling like a fraud. Another factor that is important to consider is for those who become educated, who go for higher education, and then having your family or your friends make you feel as if you're not fully educated for the quote real world. Whether that's intentionally or not intentional, it's still undermining your education and making you feel as if you don't even know what you're talking about, whether that's academically or, quote, as they say, in the real world. It's almost as if these two things don't interconnect with each other. And then we have this pressure to achieve. So I talked about this in my previous episode too, when your family has sacrificed so much to help you, whether that's emotionally or financially. And I gave the example that my parents gave up a lot for me to be able to go to college. So I had this feeling of pressure to achieve and succeed in everything that I did. It gives you an added pressure of not wanting to disappoint your family members and not wanting to feel like they wasted their resources and efforts on you. It pushes the agenda that your efforts are not good enough if you are not succeeding. But if you're working hard to prove a point that their efforts are worth it, I think then you're truly never really learning to accept your own achievements and you'll just continue the path of feeling like you're not deserving of whatever achievements that you've reached. And according to the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, imposter syndrome also goes hand in hand with perfectionism, which also goes hand in hand with workaholism, which is wanting every task to be done perfectly and rarely asking for help, and where workaholism is working so hard that you put your own boundaries and your own personal agendas aside to complete your tasks for work. So as you can see, everything is starting to come together. And if you can relate to a lot of these things, whether it's a point from each episode, you can start to see that you're learning how to pinpoint what these things are. And hopefully you're taking the steps to learn how you can address these. So now let's talk about how to overcome imposter syndrome. A big one for me is talking to my mentors. So finding solace in knowing that your peers, if we're talking academically here, also feel similar pressure as you, and you're not alone in this feeling. Like I said, when I try to picture myself as an attorney or even owning my own firm one day, which is ultimately what I would love to do, it's hard for me to envision myself. So I didn't really have a mentor now that I'm out of college. So I did the next best thing. I went to social media, I went on Instagram, and I started following accounts that showed Latinas in position of power, whether that's CEOs of their own company or attorneys owning their own firms or being attorneys in every single field possible. I started following their accounts to be able to surround myself with people who had like minded dreams of myself and remind myself that what I'm feeling isn't unique to me. What I'm feeling is something that many people feel, and the dreams that I have also are not unique to me in the sense that there isn't somebody out there who's willing to hear me out and who's willing to help me out. It does feel a little bit better knowing that there is a community out there that's willing to hear me out, whether I know them personally or not. Just being able to see how far they've come and where they're going and where they're succeeding and the struggles and tribulations that they've gone through, that shows me that there are people out there who are willing to help people like myself. Another one is reminding yourself that stepping out of your comfort zone is all a learning opportunity, and teach yourself to get into that mindset of accepting learning opportunities. This allows you to view the new situation with a little less stress and seems a little less daunting. When you accept a new learning situation, you start to prepare yourself to learn from whatever outcome it may be and not focus so much on trying to get a specific outcome. If you think about it this way, if you're trying to get an outcome and you're so focused on that, you're going to close yourself off to any and all opportunities or any and all options that may deviate from what you think will get you to that ultimate target and that ultimate outcome. But if you take this as a learning opportunity, you're going to be more open to hearing out what other people are suggesting or other things that you may find that you see are working out better. Because at the end of the day, it's not about necessarily succeeding or having a specific outcome. It's learning from whatever happens at the end. Even if it comes out as something that wasn't your ultimate outcome, what did you learn from that? How can you grow from that? Those are the things that you're going to start to teach yourself to get in the habit of picking up rather than feeling so disappointed if you don't get the outcome that you want. And I'm not saying you're not going to get disappointed if you don't get the outcome that you want. I'm just saying that you're teaching yourself to look at things as a learning opportunity and allowing yourself to get into that mindset rather than automatically shutting down and getting upset for not getting the outcome that you wanted. The next is recognizing your expertise. Sometimes it's hard to recognize and acknowledge that we're actually educated and we're actually pretty good experts at whatever field it is that we're working in. I think I can only speak for myself, but coming again from a minoritized community, it's sometimes hard to embrace what you do know because you don't want to come off as bragging or you don't want to come off like you think you're better than someone. Because realistically, there's not a lot of Latinos who do pursue higher education. This generation now has done a really great job at empowering our community and our youth to strive for higher education and higher positions of authority, whether they get higher education or not. But before that, we didn't have that much of that. So it's almost like you don't want to come off like you're bragging or you think you're better than someone if you say or acknowledge that, yeah, I am an expert in this field. I am good at doing this. I know what I'm talking about. And I would love to hear if this is something that you have experienced. So, something that can help with that is doing something as small as tutoring someone else in a subject that you're knowledgeable in. This will help you realize how experienced you actually are. You're not just saying that you are just because you have a certain certification for it. You're focusing on helping someone else using the knowledge base that you have rather than focusing on trying to hide the supposed fraud. So when you focus on actually trying to help another person, the things that you know and the knowledge base that you have just naturally starts flowing out of you, and you don't focus so much on trying to know everything to the point where you feel like you have to overcompensate for supposedly being a fraud. Another is remember what you do well. IAMS encourage their clients to make a list of things that they're truly good at and areas where they might need more improvement. This may help you give you a tangible idea of what you're good at and what you can use more room for improvement. I personally have never practiced this, but I feel like this is something that I should be doing because I often get into my head and I'm like, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing. Like, what if I'm not good at that? I give myself a lot of what if scenarios. So I think this is something that I'm personally going to start doing. I like to write things out. So I think this is something that's very manageable for me to just take a moment and sit back, perhaps every week, write down one or two things that I feel I excelled in or I just did pretty great in, that I felt comfortable doing. And lastly, talk to someone who can help. If you find that you can't overcome the feeling of imposter syndrome no matter what you do, and it's starting to affect your life and causing anxiety, it would be worth considering individual therapy services. Keep in mind there is nothing wrong with needing a little extra help and accepting the help that someone is giving. There's nothing wrong with admitting that therapy might be an option for you. This can not only help you with just the imposter syndrome, but also give you really great coping mechanisms. And also keep in mind that if one therapist doesn't work for whatever reason, whether it's your schedule or your personalities, that's okay. It's okay to say, hey, you know what? I think I need a new therapist, and you find a new one. If you guys want to know more about how to go about therapy services and finding a therapist that works for you, I'm more than happy to make an episode about that. So please let me know. But overall, I would love to know what your experiences are with imposter syndrome. And now that you guys know what it is, I would love to know if you feel you've experienced it before in your lifetime and how you feel you are overcoming it or dealing with it. Feel free to write in your stories using the link in the bio on Instagram. That's where you can write in your comments, questions, concerns, or if you have any other topics you would like me to talk about, that's where you can submit all that information. So I'll be sure to have it on the link in my bio so you can go ahead and access that. But that brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all enjoyed this episode on imposter syndrome, and I hope you all learned some helpful tips to overcome it. Until next time, embrace the day.